My parents suspended my schooling until I apologized to their beloved golden boy. I didn't argue. I didn't beg. I just said, "All right." The way their faces froze should have told them something. But the next morning, Rowan was still smirking until he opened my locker and saw it stripped bare my transfer papers already filed, time-stamped and irreversible. He sprinted across the hall, panic in his voice I'd never heard before. "Please tell me you haven't posted it." And the moment he dragged my parents in to see the proof, my father's smile collapsed like he finally realized something he never expected. The son he overlooked wasn't bluffing anymore. Posted what he asked. And for the first time in my life, I enjoyed watching him fear the answer. My name is Alden Mercer, and if you've ever been the shadow child in your own family, what I'm about to tell you might feel painfully familiar. But before I share my story with you, I want to know you're here with me. Just say, "listening" in the comments, or tell me where you're watching from. I love seeing how far my story can reach. Sometimes even the smallest connection can make a story feel heard. Thank you. And now, here's my story. And if you'd like to stay with me through the rest of it, I'd be grateful if you could subscribe to the channel. It means more than you know. I was 30 years old, sitting at a dining table that still felt foreign no matter how long I'd lived in that house. After years of working to support everyone but myself, I'd finally returned to Portland Ridge to finish the degree I'd put on hold. I thought school would be a clean restart, something untouched by the Mercer family's long, exhausting tradition of choosing Rowan over me. But the moment my parents invited me to dinner with the vague excuse that the family needed to talk, I felt the old dread settling in. Rowan walked in last, shoulders, loose chin tilted just enough to say he'd already won something. He slid into his chair wearing that familiar smirk, the one that always meant I'd been volunteered for another sacrifice. Then Dad set down his fork, looked at me like a judge passing sentence, and announced that starting Monday I would be suspended from all classes until I apologized publicly to Rowan for damaging the family's reputation. Mom clasped her hands dramatically, insisting I should think of Harmony. Rowan lowered his gaze and pretended to look wounded while spinning the same false story about the fight I'd witnessed with my own eyes. Listening to them, it was painfully clear this wasn't a discussion. It was a verdict. They weren't interested in the truth. They just needed me to bend. And maybe the old version of me would have begged or tried to explain, but not this time. I looked at all three of them and said, "All right." The silence that followed was almost comical. For once, they didn't know what to do with me. Mom blinked. Dad frowned like he'd missed a line in a script. Even Rowan's smirk twitched. I pushed my chair back, excused myself, and walked upstairs as calmly as if we'd just finished dessert. None of them knew I'd been preparing to leave Portland for months. None of them knew I'd already packed half my life into 2 suitcases. But halfway up the stairs, I heard Rowan whisper to Dad, "Everything will go back to how it was before he showed up." That one sentence told me more than any fight we'd ever had. It wasn't just entitlement, it was hatred. Quiet, entitled hatred, and I knew there was no version of staying that didn't end with me disappearing piece by piece. I closed my bedroom door, gently stared at the packed bags in the corner, and told myself the truth: this would be my last night under the Mercer roof. No matter what happened next, I was done being their designated scapegoat. The memory of what pushed everything over the edge came back with perfect clarity. The fight hadn't even involved me, at least not until Rowan dragged my name into it. I had been walking through the underground parking lot at Portland Ridge when I heard shouting echoing off the concrete. I turned a corner and saw Ethan Ward, a freshman, skinny, terrified, on the ground with blood dripping between his fingers. Rowan towered over him, fists still clenched, knuckles red and raw. It didn't matter that I saw it all. The security camera captured the entire thing from an angle even Rowan couldn't argue with. Security dragged him into the disciplinary office moments later, and because Rowan told them I was involved, I was called in too. The second I stepped inside, he was already selling his version. According to him, Ethan provoked him first, and I had spent the morning getting in his head, pushing him until he snapped. I almost laughed, but instead I pulled out my phone and showed the committee the hallway footage from that same morning. Rowan and I hadn't crossed paths once. That video shredded his story in seconds. Dean Rutherford issued a 14-day suspension on the spot. Rowan didn't fight it. He just stared at me with a hatred so sharp it felt like a warning. I knew right then he wasn't done. And I was right. When I got home, Rowan had already performed his victim routine for my parents. By the time I walked through the door, they were ready with their script, blaming me, insisting I withdraw my statement, telling me my honesty would hurt Rowan's future. They said I should take responsibility as the older brother. They said I should fix things. It was the first time I refused them. And that refusal, the very first boundary I'd set in years, is what led to the performance at dinner. As if that wasn't enough, Ethan texted me later that night saying he was willing to testify if things escalated. I appreciated it more than he knew, but I also knew exactly how my parents operated. If I stayed and fought, they'd twist the story until I became the problem. They always had. That night, staring at Ethan's message, I realized something I'd tried not to admit for years. The Mercers would rather break me than let Rowan face consequences. And if I didn't walk away soon, they'd succeed. I grew up learning that in the Mercer household, blame had a permanent address, and it always pointed toward me. Every memory I replayed that night stitched itself together into one long confirmation that leaving wasn't an overreaction, it was survival. When I was 16, Rowan set the neighbor's bike on fire because the kid got a newer model than his. The smoke was still in the air when my parents dragged me outside and told the neighbor it had been a stupid mistake on my part. I remember standing there heart pounding while Rowan hid behind Mom's shoulder with his head bowed like the innocent one. That was the first time I realized truth didn't matter in our house. Image did. 4 years later, when I was 20, Rowan stumbled home drunk and crashed straight into the living room window, shattering the glass from waist height to the frame. I was upstairs at the time, yet somehow the fault landed squarely on me. Dad said I should have been there to keep an eye on him, as if supervising a grown teenager was my job. The absurd part was how naturally they assigned responsibility to me, like it was muscle memory for them. At 22, when I finally earned a scholarship that could have taken me across the country to study architecture, I thought my life might finally split from his. But Mom sat me down, held my hand, and said Rowan needed his brother at home to guide him. Dad backed her, and with no support and no savings of my own, the choice was made for me. Every opportunity I had was quietly redirected so Rowan could feel stable, centered, catered to. I didn't want to accept the bitterness that came with remembering these things, but ignoring it only kept me stuck. What broke whatever was left of my loyalty wasn't even the past, it was what I uncovered recently. I found out the college fund in my name had been drained years ago. Most of it was transferred directly into Rowan's account when he entered high school. They didn't even tell me. And the rest, he burned through it, dealing with messes he never took responsibility for. Parking fines, broken property, impulsive spending, even covering up situations that could have gotten him expelled years earlier. He never stopped asking them for more because he knew they'd never refuse him. The foundation of our family wasn't love, it was dependence, and I was the one expected to uphold it. That night, staring at my half-finished transfer application, everything aligned. This was why my quiet, "all right" at dinner wasn't surrender. It was a door closing behind me. I opened my laptop, looked over the documents again, and hit save. For the first time in my life, the decision was mine. I leaned back in the chair, whispering to myself that this would be the last time they had any say in who I became. The next morning, the room felt hollow, like it already belonged to someone else. My 2 suitcases stood by the door, zipped tight, ready for the life I hadn't fully let myself imagine yet. I was sitting on the edge of my bed when a violent pounding shook the door. Rowan barged in the moment I opened it. His eyes were wide hair, a mess, breathing sharp like he'd run across the house. He pushed past me and froze at the sight of my empty closet, the hangers swaying slightly as if mocking him. He spun toward me, asking whether I'd sent it in a voice that cracked at the edges. I didn't answer immediately, and that only made him panic more. He rushed out, thundered down the stairs, and in seconds I heard him shouting my name, followed by the scrape of my laptop being yanked off the table. By the time I made it down, he had already pulled up the acceptance email, the school crest bright on the screen, and both my parents were standing over him like they were witnessing a crime scene. Dad tried to mask the tremor in his voice when he posted what I told them calmly, that I had completed the application days ago, and that all I'd needed was my advisor's confirmation. Mom clutched the counter as if she were holding herself upright, repeating that I was destroying the family. Rowan kept muttering something to himself until he finally admitted in front of everyone that he never thought I'd actually leave. He had told his friends I would be forced to apologize to him, that everything would go back to normal. Hearing him say that out loud only solidified everything I'd known my whole life. I told Dad I'd transferred the car title months ago, moved my phone plan into my own name, and ensured every financial tie between us no longer existed. He stiffened like he'd been slapped, realizing his leverage was gone. Mom stared at me like she didn't recognize the person in front of her. They tried briefly and desperately to regain control, demanding explanations, asking who helped me, telling me I was making a mistake. But the truth had already unraveled. They couldn't stop me without crossing lines they no longer had the authority to cross. I told them if they tried to interfere, I had legal support and documentation in place. Rowan's composure disintegrated. He slammed my laptop closed so hard it echoed through the kitchen, his face twisted in something between rage and fear. For the first time, he saw what losing privilege looked like. And for the first time, I didn't flinch. I simply watched him, understanding fully that his panic wasn't about me leaving the family, it was about the world no longer revolving around him. I walked into the kitchen to find my parents in the middle of a frantic argument, circling each other as if sheer noise could somehow stop what was already set in motion. They didn't notice me at first, which told me everything about their priorities. Dad was insisting there had to be a way to keep me in Portland, to make the school change its decision to reverse whatever I had done. Mom kept repeating that I was overreacting, that families work things out, that Rowan would fall apart if I left. When they finally turned toward me, Dad delivered his final threat like a business ultimatum. If I walked out, he would strip me of everything, my car, my phone, any financial support. I told him none of that belonged to him anymore, and the shock on his face was almost theatrical. He looked as if I had broken a rule. He didn't remember writing a rule where I was supposed to remain dependent. Mom called me ungrateful, said Rowan needed me, that I didn't understand what my leaving would do to him. I told her I understood perfectly that I had spent most of my life being held back in the name of helping him. I explained that I had already applied for independent student status, and that once the school validated it, I would be legally beyond their reach. My phone started vibrating. I answered, and Attorney Atticus Vale appeared on the screen. He greeted me, then informed me within earshot of both my parents that the documentation had been approved and delivered, and that any attempt to interfere with my departure could trigger legal consequences. I put him on speaker. Atticus calmly explained that physical obstruction, withholding personal property, or intimidation could prompt the involvement of local authorities. Dad didn't have a response. It was the first time I'd seen him run out of instructions. Rowan tried to jump into the moment, claiming he didn't mean for the fight to blow up, that he just lost control, that I could fix things if I wanted to. His voice wasn't remorseful. It was desperate. It was the plea of someone terrified of losing the pedestal he'd been standing on his entire life. Then he slipped. He admitted he had used most of the money from the college fund to pay off debts from problems Mom and Dad had tried to hide from me. Dad's expression fell apart, and Mom looked as if someone had drained the room of oxygen. For the first time, they saw Rowan without the layer of excuses they had wrapped him in for decades. I told them plainly that I wasn't responsible for cleaning up any more messes. Not his, not theirs. I said I hoped they figured it out, but it would no longer involve me. Then I walked out the back door before anyone could respond. The cold Portland air hit me like a clean break, sharp and bracing, and I knew the real conflict hadn't ended. It had just shifted, opening a space I finally wanted to step into. The next morning, I headed to Portland Ridge to finalize my transfer paperwork. The campus felt different, as if word had traveled faster than I had. Groups of students whispered when I passed by, some curious, some awkwardly sympathetic, most confused about why the Mercer brothers were suddenly the center of every conversation. Rowan was waiting at the front gate, pacing like a guard stationed at his post. When he saw me, his expression hardened into something between panic and defiance. He stepped in front of me, blocking my path, demanding that I retract everything I said and apologize to him publicly. He claimed it was the only way to save his reputation, the only way to make things right. I told him I wasn't going to repeat the cycle. His actions were his problem, not mine. When I tried to move past him, he grabbed my arm hard enough to make the surrounding students gasp. Training and instinct took over. I twisted out of his grip, sending him stumbling toward the fence. A circle formed instantly, phones raised voices murmuring as Rowan scrambled back to his feet. I didn't waste time arguing. I walked straight to the administrative office where Dean Rutherford was already waiting. He looked relieved to see me and ushered me inside. My parents were there too, called in because the tension between Rowan and me had become impossible for the staff to ignore. Mom's eyes were already red. Dad's jaw clenched so tight I could see a muscle jumping near his temple. Dean Rutherford laid the documents on the desk and explained that my scholarship had been officially activated, the transfer had been approved, and all academic obligations here were now concluded. Mom broke down, saying I was tearing the family apart. Dad stayed quiet, his stare fixed on the desk. Then Dean revealed something none of them expected. He said Rowan's incident with Ethan wasn't an isolated case. There had been other complaints, other altercations, other situations quietly handled because my parents had pressured the administration behind closed doors. Mom's head snapped toward him, shocked he would say it aloud. Dad's shoulders slumped in a way I had never seen. Rowan entered the room moments later, face blotchy, eyes frantic. He dropped to his knees in front of me, begging me not to leave, promising things would be different, insisting he needed me. But everyone in the room could see it wasn't change. He feared it was losing the protection he had always been guaranteed. I didn't say anything. I didn't owe them another explanation. I stood, collected the file Dean handed me, and walked out. As I stepped into the hallway, I realized it was lined with students. At first I thought they were blocking the passage, but then the first clap echoed off the lockers and the next, and then the entire corridor filled with applause. It wasn't loud or chaotic. It was steady, deliberate, almost like a send-off. The captain of the debate team met my eyes and nodded. I nodded back and kept walking. I didn't look behind me when I pushed open the front doors and stepped into the crisp morning air. For the first time, leaving didn't feel like running. It felt like finally stepping out of a loop that had been draining the life out of me for 30 years. Tuesday morning arrived colder and quieter than any morning I had ever spent in that house. I woke before the alarm, fully dressed, sitting at the edge of my bed as the silence pressed against my ears. In the kitchen downstairs, I could hear the faint tick of the wall clock, sharp, steady, the only sound in a home that suddenly felt emptied of every illusion we had lived under. I carried my 2 suitcases down the stairs, one in each hand, and found all 3 of them waiting in the living room, as if this were some kind of staged farewell. My father stood with his arms folded, trying to appear detached, but the tension in his knuckles gave him away. My mother's face was drained of color, her lips trembling with things she had no language for. Rowan hovered behind them, eyes red from a night without sleep, looking far smaller than the version of him they had always protected. I greeted them quietly, but no one spoke back. The air felt thick, like I was preparing to walk out of a stranger's house, not the place where I'd spent most of my life. When the school car honked outside the front gate, Mom lunged forward and grabbed my wrist, begging me to stop, sobbing that I was destroying everything. I gently pulled my arm free and told her the family had destroyed itself long before this moment. Dad stepped forward suddenly and tossed something onto the table, a worn, dusty notebook he claimed he found in the old storage boxes. He said it was my childhood journal, something I should read again to remember who I was. I opened it, skimmed the first few pages, and felt a knot tighten in my chest. Every entry was a version of me taking the blame for Rowan. Pages and pages of confusion, fear, and resignation written by a kid who never understood why responsibility always landed on him. Dad had hoped it would soften me. Instead, it felt like the final confirmation that I was right to leave. Rowan stepped toward me with shaky steps, whispering an apology that sounded more like a request for reassurance. He followed it by asking me not to leave over something small, proving he still had no grasp of what this was really about. I didn't answer. I walked out the door, climbed into the waiting car, and shut the door on all 3 of them. As the driver pulled away, I watched the house shrink into the distance and felt both relief and anger sweep through me. It shouldn't have taken 30 years to break free. New York greeted me with gray skies and the hum of traffic layered over voices, horns, construction, life in motion. It felt overwhelming in a way that made me breathe deeper. At Columbia Heights Academy, the staff showed me to my dorm room and handed me my keys. As soon as I set my bags down, a faculty advisor approached and explained that my application had stood out not just academically but personally. They believed I would be a strong fit for a leadership program they were expanding. The idea that my past, those years of being silenced and overlooked, could be seen as resilience instead of weakness left me speechless. Shortly after, another staff member mentioned that the admissions office had received an anonymous letter attempting to smear my name, but they had investigated and dismissed it as baseless. I knew immediately where it came from, but I said nothing. That night, standing before the fourth-floor window overlooking the city, the lights flickering across a skyline I had never seen up close before, I felt something unfamiliar settle inside me. It wasn't victory. It wasn't even joy. It was the simple, solid truth that this was the first chapter of my life I would write without anyone else's hand on the page. 6 years passed in a way that didn't feel rushed until I looked back and realized how far I'd traveled from the night I left Portland. I graduated from Columbia University, completed 2 major research projects, and eventually accepted a position as a policy advisor in Washington, D.C. My days now had a rhythm that made sense: morning runs along the waterfront with Valor trotting beside me, long hours spent drafting recommendations, and meeting with teams who valued my input, quiet evenings in my apartment overlooking the river. There were no raised voices, no accusations, no weight pressing down on my shoulders. It was the first time I understood what stability actually felt like. Mentoring young debaters became one of the highlights of my week. Guiding them reminded me that influence doesn't have to come from control or fear. I was finally in a place where I could support people without losing myself in the process. One afternoon, my inbox lit up with an email from Portland Ridge. They wanted me to confirm details related to an ongoing disciplinary process involving Rowan. I stared at the screen for a long moment and then closed the email without replying. Whatever was happening back there belonged to him, not me. A few days later, Kayla, one of the few classmates who had stayed in touch, sent me a message. She said my parents had divorced 2 years after I left. Rowan had been expelled from the technical school he enrolled in, and he was working an overnight shift at a grocery store. There was no judgment in her tone, just facts. I didn't feel satisfaction or sadness. People end up where their choices lead them, no matter how long those choices were shielded from consequences. I had blocked every number from Portland years ago. If they tried to reach me now, the calls went nowhere. I had no intention of reopening a door that had taken so much strength to close. Then one morning, Atticus Vale forwarded me a scanned document. It was the same childhood journal my father had thrown on the table the day I left. Someone had mailed it to his office anonymously. As I read through it slowly, page by page, I found entries I hadn't understood as a child. Moments where my parents strategized about how to protect Rowan's image, conversations about keeping certain incidents quiet, reminders to make sure Alden steps up. It wasn't new information, but seeing it laid out in handwriting I recognized from my earliest years made everything sharper. I realized I had never fled from a family. I had escaped an environment that never allowed me to exist as myself. I closed the journal and placed it in a drawer I rarely opened. My life had moved forward, and there was nothing left behind worth returning to. I went back to preparing the research paper I was set to present at a conference, the first published under my name alone. Before heading out for my evening run, I paused by the window, looked at the river turning orange under the sunset, and rested my hand on Valor's head. Home was no longer a place I was born into. It was a space I built breath by breath, boundary by boundary. When I stepped outside, I felt the same quiet certainty that had carried me out of Portland. I wasn't defined by what I left behind. I was defined by the life I chose, and choosing my own freedom had been the strongest decision I ever made. Even now, 6 years later, there are mornings when I catch myself pausing at the window of my apartment, watching the river break into soft ripples under the sunrise, and I wonder how different my life might have been if I had never left Portland. Sometimes I imagine the version of me who stayed the version, who kept quiet, kept bending, kept apologizing for things he didn't do. That version feels distant now, almost like a stranger I once knew, but can't quite remember clearly. I don't hate him. I just don't belong to him anymore. What I do remember vividly is the moment I realized I was allowed to choose myself. Not in a dramatic, cinematic way, not with fireworks or some life-changing epiphany. It came slowly then, all at once, standing in the kitchen while my family begged, demanded, manipulated, and pleaded for control they no longer had. It came when I stepped out of that house carrying nothing but 2 suitcases and every truth I had swallowed for decades. It came when the city of New York rose up in front of me like a reminder that life could be bigger than the walls I grew up inside. And it came later during all the quiet nights when I sat alone in my dorm room and realized for the first time that silence could be peaceful and not terrifying. Leaving didn't instantly fix everything. Healing isn't a straight line, it's a long, uneven path full of old triggers and unexpected memories. There were days at Columbia Heights when I doubted myself, when I felt like an imposter, when I wondered if my family had been right about me all along. There were nights when the loneliness crept in, whispering the old lie that choosing freedom meant choosing isolation. But life has a way of surprising you when you stop living for someone else's approval. The people I met, the students I mentored, the professors who believed in me, the colleagues who trusted my ideas, slowly rebuilt the parts of me I thought were ruined beyond repair. Valor with his clumsy paws and stubborn loyalty grounded me in ways I didn't know I needed. And the younger version of myself, the one who wrote desperate journal entries about taking blame for things he didn't do, finally found peace knowing he didn't grow up to repeat the same cycle. If there's one thing I've learned, it's this: walking away from where you were hurt doesn't make you weak. It makes you brave enough to believe in the possibility of something better. And sometimes the bravest thing you can do is simply say, I deserve more than this. People often ask whether I ever think about reconnecting with my family. The truth is, I don't spend much energy on the what-ifs anymore. I don't carry bitterness. I don't wait for apologies that may never come. I don't replay old arguments or wonder how things might have been if they had loved me differently. I let all of that go. Not for them, for me. Because closure isn't always a conversation. Sometimes it's just the quiet understanding that your life is finally your own. Every morning when I step out for a run with Valor trotting beside me, I'm reminded that freedom isn't loud. It doesn't always look like victory. Sometimes it's just the steadiness in your chest when you realize no one is holding anything over your head anymore. Sometimes it's choosing your own pace for the first time and knowing no one can steal it from you. And when I walk into the policy office or stand in front of a room full of students or submit a research paper with my name on it alone, I feel grounded in a way I never felt in that old house. I don't need them to see who I've become. I don't need them to validate my choices. I didn't become successful to prove them wrong. I became myself to prove me right. If you're listening to this right now and you've ever felt overshadowed, overlooked, dismissed, or blamed for simply existing, then maybe this story is yours too, in ways you haven't said out loud yet. And if you're standing at the edge of a decision that scares you, wondering whether choosing yourself is selfish, let me tell you, it's not. It's necessary. Sometimes you have to leave the version of your life that hurts in order to step into the one that heals. And before I end my story here, I want to know you're still with me. If you're listening, if this touched you in any way, or if you've ever felt like you had to fight for your own worth, drop a simple hi or tell me where you're watching from. I always read your comments, and knowing you're here turns this from a monologue into a conversation. Sometimes just knowing someone is out there listening makes all the difference. And the more distance I've put between myself and the life I left behind, the more I've realized something I wish I had learned sooner. Sometimes we don't lose families, we outgrow them. Not out of arrogance, not out of coldness, but because staying small to keep other people comfortable eventually becomes its own kind of quiet death. I spent so many years shrinking so Rowan could shine, bending so my parents wouldn't break, swallowing my needs so their narrative could stay intact. And when I finally stepped away, the world didn't fall apart. Only the illusions did. 6 years later, I can see the difference between love and loyalty, between comfort and control. Love grows with you. Control demands that you remain who you were at your weakest. Loyalty is mutual, guilt is not. And comfort should feel safe, not suffocating. I didn't understand any of this when I lived under the Mercer roof. But I understand it now. Every time I write an advisory memo that influences real policy, every time someone in my team asks for guidance because they trust me, every time someone younger tells me they want to follow a path they didn't know was possible. There is no greater freedom than choosing the man you become. Sometimes late at night I walk down to the river behind my building and let the wind off the water wrap around me. The city lights shimmer on the surface like a reminder that the world really is bigger than the childhood that once tried to contain me. I breathe differently out there, full, steady, unhurried. Valor sits beside me, head leaning against my leg, and I watch boats drift like quiet thoughts across the water. In those moments, I don't think about Portland or the Mercer House. I think about possibility, about the kid I used to be and the man I finally allowed myself to become, about how pain can shape you without defining you. I've learned that healing doesn't mean rewriting the past. It means refusing to let it dictate the future. It means accepting that some doors are better left closed, not because what's behind them is unforgivable, but because what's ahead is finally your own. For a long time, I believed that walking away meant I had failed my family. But now I know it meant I refused to fail myself. And if you're listening to this, maybe you're carrying your own version of that weight. Maybe you're wondering if you're allowed to choose a life that looks nothing like the one you were handed. Maybe you're standing on the edge of a decision that feels impossible. If so, hear me clearly, you're allowed to choose peace. You're allowed to choose growth. You're allowed to choose a future that makes room for you, not just as someone's child, sibling, or expectation, but as a person with your own needs and dreams. If any part of my story feels familiar, even in small ways, I hope you know you're not alone. I hope you know your voice matters, even if nobody in your house ever listened. And I hope you know that leaving isn't always abandonment. Sometimes it's the first step toward coming home to yourself. Before we close this chapter, I'd love to hear from you. Drop a still here in the comments if you made it this far, or tell me what the weather is like where you're listening. I always love seeing how far these stories travel, how many places they land, how many hearts they reach. And if you haven't already, consider subscribing. It helps this little community grow, and it lets me keep sharing stories that might help someone else breathe a little easier. Wherever you are, whatever you're facing, remember this: you deserve a life that feels like yours. And sometimes the first step is simply believing that you do. And as I'm sitting here tonight, the city humming softly beneath my window, I realize something simple but powerful: peace doesn't arrive with applause. It arrives quietly, almost shyly, in the small moments you once overlooked. The first morning you wake up and don't brace for conflict. The first decision you make without hearing someone else's voice in your head. The first time you laugh without wondering who might use it against you. These moments are small, almost ordinary, but together they become a new life. Sometimes I wonder if my younger self would recognize me now. The boy who wrote in that old journal trying to make sense of a world that blamed him for everything. Would he believe he'd grow into someone who sets boundaries without fear? Someone who creates his own home, builds his own peace, chooses his own future? Maybe he wouldn't. But I think he'd be proud. And if you're listening, maybe a part of you needs to hear this too. You're allowed to rewrite your story, even if others don't understand. You're allowed to walk away from what hurts, even if no one cheers for you. You're allowed to grow into someone your younger self would look at and say, "We made it." If you're still here with me, leave a "I'm here" in the comments. It means more than you know. And don't forget to subscribe if you want to walk with me through more stories like this. Stories of breaking cycles, choosing freedom, and building a life that finally feels like your own.